It was a crisp early morning in the heart of the city. The downtown streets were already buzzing with activity as the sun slowly crept over the horizon, casting long shadows between the towering glass buildings. Commuters hurried along the sidewalks, their footsteps quickening as the workday loomed large. Traffic had already begun to back up, the honking of horns mingling with the distant hum of a city that never quite slept. The familiar rhythm of the morning rush, bright-eyed office workers, delivery trucks making their rounds, baristas crafting lattes behind glass windows, had set the tone for another ordinary day. But not everyone was here just to get through the motions. In the midst of the crowd walked a woman, poised and composed, her every step confident and deliberate. She was in her late 30s, tall, with a presence that commanded attention without needing to raise her voice. Clad in a well-tailored navy suit that complemented her figure, her heels clicked firmly on the pavement, announcing her arrival to anyone who happened to glance her way. A sleek black briefcase was tucked under her arm, its weight more symbolic than necessary. This was a woman who carried not just a job, but a mission. Today, she was heading toward a new chapter in her career. It wasn't just any job. Today marked the first day she would walk into the courthouse, not as a lawyer, but as a judge, the newest addition to the district court. It was a significant achievement, one that many in her life would have once thought impossible. Raised in a neighborhood where dreams were often constrained by circumstances, where doors closed simply because of the color of her skin, she had defied every expectation. Years of tireless work, of proving herself over and over again, had led her to this moment. Today she would begin shaping the very system that had once made her feel invisible. But the city she now walked through, the streets she had navigated countless times, hadn't yet caught up with her accomplishments. As she approached her car, two police officers stepped out from behind a nearby squad car, their postures stiff and their expressions unreadable. Their presence, though seemingly routine in a city accustomed to law enforcement, felt out of place. Without warning, they halted her progress. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the officers called out, his voice firm but not yet confrontational. "What are you doing here?" The second officer, his eyes scanning her carefully, added, "Where are you headed?" It was a simple question, but it carried an underlying tone of suspicion, an unspoken judgment that she didn't quite belong in the area. The morning sunlight had begun to filter through the tall buildings, casting long shadows across the streets, but the warmth of the day had yet to reach the two officers standing by their squad car. Officer number 1, a young man in his mid-20s, shifted nervously from one foot to the other. It was his first few weeks on the force, and while he was eager to prove himself, his inexperience made him twitchy. His eyes flickered to the woman before him, her sharp suit, her professional gait, and something about her didn't sit right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his gut was telling him to be cautious. He glanced over at Officer number 2, a seasoned cop in his mid-40s, whose weathered face had seen enough of the city's underbelly to know what to look for. Officer number 2 had been on the force for over 15 years, and though he wasn't as outwardly nervous as his partner, he was quicker to trust his instincts. And right now, his instincts told him that something about this woman didn't quite add up. "I'll handle this one," Officer number 2 muttered under his breath, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing this for far too long. He didn't give the woman a chance to answer Officer number 1's initial questions. He was already framing a narrative in his head. She doesn't belong here. "You live around here?" Officer number 2 asked, his tone sharp. The woman paused, her eyes steady as she answered him with the same calmness she had shown since they first approached. "I'm not from here. I'm on my way to work." The officer's brow furrowed. He was already dismissing her response, not interested in hearing the details. "Work? Where?" Before she could respond, Officer number 1 piped up, his voice tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "Yeah. Where exactly do you work? You don't look like you're headed to an office." It was subtle, but it was there. The tone in Officer Number One's voice made it clear that he was questioning the woman's place in the city, as if her appearance, professional but unmistakably different from what they were used to seeing in this neighborhood, was enough to make him suspicious. Officer Number Two didn't back down either. He was already scanning her, the way she was standing, too composed, too calm for someone who was being stopped on the street by police officers. There was something about her confidence that felt out of place, almost defiant. The assumption wasn't spoken aloud, but it hung in the air between them. She doesn't belong here. We've got a lot of crimes in this area, Officer Number Two continued, his eyes narrowing. You sure you're in the right place? At this point, the woman's patience was beginning to show signs of wear, but she didn't let it show on her face. She could feel the undercurrent of racial profiling flowing through the conversation. She had lived through it before. But instead of showing anger, she kept her tone level and unflinching. Yes. I'm sure I'm in the right place. I'm headed to work. Officer Number One exchanged a quick glance with his partner, his eyes betraying doubt. He was trying to put the pieces together, but the woman was throwing him off. She looks like she's got money, he thought. But why would she be walking around here? This isn't the kind of place you'd expect someone dressed like that to be. What's in that briefcase? Officer Number One asked suddenly, his voice gaining a more accusatory edge. Looks a little heavy for someone just heading to work. The woman's gaze sharpened, but she didn't flinch. Documents, she replied curtly. Officer Number Two didn't miss a beat. Documents for what? You a lawyer or something? There it was. The moment the assumptions crystallized. A black woman in a suit with a briefcase? The officer's collective judgment settled into place. She was out of context in their eyes. She wasn't the image they were used to associating with success or professionalism. No, she had to be a criminal. As the woman stood before them, unfazed and still exuding quiet authority, the officers' conversation shifted. They began to talk amongst themselves, their words low but not subtle. I don't know, man, Officer Number One murmured. She seems too polished, you know? People like her don't usually walk around here unless they're up to something. Yeah, Officer Number Two grunted in agreement. She's got that lawyer vibe. Maybe she's doing some shady deal. I bet she's been around here before. Both officers were growing more convinced that the woman was hiding something, maybe involved in a crime, or maybe just a front for something else. They had no evidence, but that didn't stop their biases from filling in the blanks. The woman, aware of the direction the conversation was taking, could sense the tension rise. She had seen this scenario unfold too many times before. The officer's suspicion was rooted not in what she had said, but in what they assumed her appearance meant. To them, her poise, her attire, and even her calmness were signs of someone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of who belongs. But she held her ground. She wasn't going to let them rattle her. Instead of reacting to their assumptions, she stayed focused. There was work to be done, and she couldn't let these moments, these attempts to undermine her, distract her from the purpose she had spent her whole life preparing for. Yet, the more they pressed, the clearer it became. They saw a woman who didn't fit the mold, and that, in their eyes, was enough to be suspicious. The tension in the air had been thickening with each passing second. The woman stood unwavering in the face of the officer's growing scrutiny. They had asked her where she was from, where she was headed, and why she was even in the area, all while subtly implying that someone of her appearance didn't belong. The accusations weren't explicit yet, but the undercurrent was clear. The officers were trying to piece together a story that fit their narrow frame of reference, and she didn't fit it. She felt their suspicion like a weight pressing on her chest. It was something she'd experienced countless times throughout her life, being doubted simply because of the color of her skin, her attire, or her demeanor. It was exhausting. But this time, there was something different about her. She had made it, and she wasn't going to let this moment define her. This wasn't just a confrontation on the street. It was a reminder of the systemic biases that still ran deep, even in the people sworn to protect and serve. As Officer Number 1 opened his mouth to question her again, a sudden, sharp ring pierced through the tension. The sound of her phone vibrating against her purse felt like an electric shock in the stillness, pulling everyone's attention toward her. The woman looked down, catching the caller ID on the screen. It was the courthouse. Her first day on the job, and the call she had been waiting for all morning had arrived. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, stopped by 2 police officers in the middle of her city, but she wasn't just any person on the street. She was about to begin a job that would change her life and change the lives of many others. She glanced at the officers and then back at her phone, quickly making the decision to take the call. The pause in the conversation made the officers look at each other in confusion. She wasn't rattled by them, or at least she didn't show it. She reached into her purse and answered the call, her voice smooth and composed, as if nothing had changed. "Good morning, Judge Williams," the voice on the other end greeted her. She could hear the warmth and respect in the voice, a direct contrast to the cold suspicion she was facing from the officers. "Good morning," she replied, her eyes still fixed on the 2 officers in front of her. She didn't flinch, didn't break her stride. "Yes, I'm looking forward to my first day. I've reviewed the docket. I see we have a few high-profile cases coming in, some cases of police misconduct, a few racial profiling cases, and a couple of wrongful conviction reviews." She spoke with authority, the kind of authority that came from years of hard-earned experience and a deep understanding of the very issues the officers themselves were contributing to. There was a pause on the other end of the line as the person on the other side processed the information. "That's great to hear. We're all excited for you. Just remember to keep your focus on the big picture. This is a new chapter for you, but it's also a chance for you to bring real change to the courtroom. We need someone like you." The woman nodded, though no one could see the gesture. She wasn't just making small talk now. She was reinforcing the importance of her role. She had already been through the storm. Today wasn't about proving herself, it was about showing the world that people like her were worthy of the highest positions of power. She would bring justice, but not just in the conventional sense. She would hold the system accountable. "I plan on addressing systemic inequities in the legal system," she continued, her voice gaining momentum as she spoke. "There's work to be done, but it starts with holding everyone accountable, the officers, the attorneys, and the court itself. We can't just keep pretending these issues aren't there." The officers' ears perked up at the mention of systemic inequities and accountability, but they stayed silent, their confusion growing with each word. Officer Number 1's eyes widened, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Officer Number 2's face went from a look of suspicion to something else, a quiet realization. They were standing in front of a person who was not just any civilian. The woman ended the call with a final confident, "I'll see you all in court," before slipping the phone back into her purse. She didn't let the silence linger for too long. She didn't need to. She turned her gaze from her purse to the officers, the energy between them shifting, the questioning, the doubt, the assumptions. All of it seemed to hang in the air, suspended for a moment before it came crashing down. "I am the new judge you'll be seeing in your courtroom today," she said, her voice calm but assertive. "I'm on my way to my first day at the bench." There was a brief pause as her words settled in the air between them. Officer Number 1 blinked, his mouth slightly agape. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with the information he had just received. The woman standing in front of them wasn't just another person caught in the web of their presumptions. She wasn't a suspect or someone who didn't belong. She was someone they had misjudged entirely. Officer Number 2's face shifted, his features hardening for a moment before a visible realization flickered in his eyes. He, too, was processing the weight of her words, the depth of his mistake. His earlier confidence evaporated like mist in the morning air. They had, at least in that moment, been wrong. Their assumptions, rooted in their own biases, had clouded their judgment. They had looked at her, seen her skin, her suit, her briefcase, and wrongly assumed she was out of place. But in the silence that followed her declaration, they realized just how wrong they had been. Officer number 1 was the first to speak, though it was less of a statement and more of a confused murmur. "You... a judge?" "Yes," the woman responded with an unflinching certainty. "I'm the new judge, and today I begin my work." Officer number 2's jaw tightened, his eyes briefly flickering to his partner before returning to the woman. I see," he said, though the words felt hollow. He cleared his throat, looking for a way to salvage the situation, but the damage had already been done. For a moment, neither officer spoke, both lost in the weight of their mistake. The woman had calmly, decisively turned the entire situation on its head. The skepticism they had once directed at her now bounced back on them. There were no easy words for it. She wasn't just a person who had been misunderstood. She was a person who had surpassed every obstacle life had thrown her way, and now they stood before her, forced to reckon with their own flawed assumptions. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" she asked politely, but the question hung with an underlying edge that made it clear she wasn't interested in being further detained. The officers exchanged a glance. Neither knew what to say. They were caught, trapped in the uncomfortable silence of their own biases. The woman, however, was already stepping toward her car, her destination unchanged. It was her first day at the courthouse, but for her, it was just another day of proving that she belonged, no matter what anyone else thought. And the officers? They were left standing in the street, their role in the moment now crystal clear. They were the ones who had failed to see her for who she truly was. The woman had just finished her exchange with the officers. The tension had evaporated, but the awkwardness lingered in the air like a heavy fog. She was about to step into her car and continue on her way to the courthouse, the first day of a career that would set a new standard in her field. But the officers, standing frozen in their own misjudgment, were left with a quiet, uncomfortable realization. It wasn't just the error in assuming she didn't belong. It was the deeper truth that they had allowed their biases to shape their actions, and in doing so, had unjustly detained a person who, by all accounts, had every right to be where she was. The younger officer, officer number 1, was the first to break the silence. He shifted on his feet, his face flushed with discomfort as he watched the woman begin to walk toward her car. His fingers twitched, as if he were trying to find the right words to undo the damage. "Excuse me, ma'am?" he called out hesitantly. His voice was shaky, betraying his unease. The woman stopped in her tracks, turning slowly to face him. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind her gaze, a reminder that her decision to continue was not just about walking away from a confrontation, but about something much bigger than this moment. "Yes?" she asked, her tone neither dismissive nor warm, but simply neutral, waiting for him to speak. I just wanted to apologize," officer number 1 stammered, his hands awkwardly at his sides. "We shouldn't have assumed anything based on your appearance. It's just that, well, I'm still getting the hang of things, and I made a mistake." His voice faltered with each word, his eyes cast downward as if he couldn't bear to make full eye contact. "I didn't mean to disrespect you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The woman didn't immediately respond. Instead, she let the apology settle in the air between them. She could tell that the younger officer was genuinely flustered, that this moment had affected him deeply. It wasn't just a surface-level apology. It felt like a man beginning to wrestle with the weight of his own assumptions and the realization that he had misjudged her, perhaps because of his own upbringing, environment, or lack of experience. After a beat, she nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without offering forgiveness just yet. She wasn't sure whether the apology was motivated by guilt or genuine reflection, but she appreciated that he had taken the step to admit his mistake. The older officer, Officer number 2, who had been standing in the background looking uncomfortable but trying to maintain his composure, cleared his throat. He shifted his weight slightly, and after a few moments of hesitation, spoke. "I also owe you an apology," he said, his voice quieter than it had been earlier, but still firm. "I didn't give you the benefit of the doubt, and that's on me. I made a snap judgment, one that was colored by bias. You didn't deserve that, and for what it's worth, I regret my part in this." His apology was more measured than the younger officer's. It didn't come with the same flustered urgency, but it carried a weight of its own. A reluctant recognition that his years of experience, which should have made him more capable of seeing beyond surface-level assumptions, had failed him. He had relied too heavily on his instincts that had been shaped by years of exposure to the very biases that permeated policing. The woman looked at him for a moment, her eyes steady. She appreciated his words, though she could tell that they came from a place of reluctance, perhaps more out of duty than desire. But still, she nodded, giving him a silent acknowledgement that she had heard him. "Thank you," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a firm edge that made it clear she wasn't letting the moment pass, without making it clear why they needed to change. "I appreciate your apologies, both of you. But let me explain why this moment is important, because it's not just about me or you. It's about the system we all work in." She paused, making sure they were both listening, her eyes sweeping from one officer to the other. "I've been stopped like this my entire life," she continued, her tone shifting slightly, gaining strength. "I've been judged based on the way I look, my skin color, the way I carry myself, what I wear. Every day I'm forced to prove that I'm more than just someone who's out of place because of how I look. And in every single encounter, like the one I had with you today, I'm faced with the reality that many people still see me as a threat, simply because of my race." Her words hung in the air, a sharp reminder that their actions were not just a mistake, they were part of a much larger, systemic issue. The officers stood still, taking in her words, though they didn't immediately respond. She could see the younger officer nodding, as if understanding the gravity of her statement, while the older officer's face hardened, his expression now unreadable. "I've had to fight my entire life to be seen as competent, as capable, as someone who belongs," she continued, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of strength that conveyed the weight of those years. "And it's not just about proving myself in my career. It's about fighting for the right to exist in spaces where people like me are automatically seen as out of place, where the first assumption is that we're not supposed to be there." There was a brief silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic, but it was heavy, a shared moment of reflection that both officers could feel, whether or not they were ready to fully understand it. "I don't expect an apology to change anything for me," she added, her gaze turning sharper. "I've spent my life facing down people who see me as something I'm not, but that doesn't make it right. I am a judge now, and I'm here to make sure that the system changes. I'm here to ensure that everyone, whether they're black, white, or any other color, gets the same opportunity to be heard. But part of my job will also be to hold people like you accountable when you don't live up to the standard you've sworn to uphold. And that includes making sure that biases like the ones you displayed today are addressed." Her words were not accusatory, but they carried the weight of truth. Officer number 2's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time his gaze shifted downward, as if acknowledging the uncomfortable truth in her statement. The younger officer, Officer number 1, appeared to be lost in thought, visibly affected by the raw honesty in her words. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" she asked, her voice not unkind but firm, as if she were offering them a chance to make a real shift in how they viewed the world. and how they viewed their role within it. Officer number 1 nodded quickly, his face a mixture of contrition and realization. I do understand. I didn't see it like that before, but I see it now. Officer number 2 didn't speak immediately, his expression hardening slightly as he seemed to process the gravity of the situation. Finally, after a long pause, he met her gaze and gave a slow, reluctant nod. Yeah, I see it too, he said quietly. We don't always realize how deep the biases run. I've been in this job long enough to know that we've got a lot of work to do. We're not immune to it, even though we should be. The woman took a slow breath, her gaze softening slightly. She could tell that this moment had made an impact, at least for today, at least for these 2 officers. Thank you, she said simply, her voice softening. Thank you for listening. With that, she turned back to her car, the encounter concluded. But the officers remained standing there, silent, reflecting on the lesson they had just learned. The lesson that would stay with them long after she had driven away. This wasn't just about making an apology, it was about recognizing the need for change, both in themselves and in the system they represented. For Officer number 1, this encounter would forever challenge his view of the world, pushing him to be more conscious of his actions and biases. For Officer number 2, it was a sobering reminder that even years of experience couldn't shield him from the harmful assumptions he'd internalized over time. As the woman drove away, they stood in the quiet aftermath of their mistake. They hadn't just learned about her. They'd learned about themselves. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Inside, the building hummed with the usual rhythm of a bustling legal institution. Lawyers in sharp suits hurried between halls, court staff shuffled papers, and the faint murmur of conversations filled the air. But as the woman stepped through the front doors, the atmosphere seemed to shift ever so slightly. There was an air of reverence in the way people looked at her, their eyes shifting toward her with recognition and respect. The staff, a mix of diverse backgrounds, gave nods and warm smiles as she walked past them. They knew who she was. She had made history before even stepping foot in the courtroom, one of the first black women to serve as a judge in this city, let alone in such a prestigious district. Her mere presence was a testament to the progress she had fought for, not just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of something much larger: hope, perseverance, and the slow but steady breaking of barriers. As she made her way to her office, there was a sense of calm purpose about her. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. She had dreamed of this day for years. She had spent her entire career breaking down the walls that had tried to keep her from reaching this position. The obstacles she had faced had been monumental, from racial profiling on the streets to systemic biases in the courtroom. But none of that could compare to what lay ahead. She had worked tirelessly to reach this point, and now it wasn't just about her. It was about the people she would represent, the lives she would touch, and the changes she would be able to effect within the justice system. As she entered her new courtroom, the sight of the polished wood of the judge's bench, the rows of empty chairs, and the intimidating sterile walls should have felt overwhelming. But instead, it felt like home. It was a place where she would make her mark, where she would prove that justice wasn't just a concept to be upheld by the powerful, but something to be redefined for the voiceless and the marginalized. She took a moment to stand at the bench, her eyes scanning the empty courtroom. The walls that had once been a place of exclusion, of intimidation, now stood as a platform for change. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the responsibility that came with this position. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about questioning how the law had been applied. Was it just? Was it fair? Who did it serve? And who was left out? This was her calling. She wasn't here just to deliver verdicts, but to ensure that the system she had been a part of for so long was reflective of the values she held dear: equity, fairness, and the protection of human dignity. Her first case, she knew, would be monumental. As a judge, she would face the intersection of law and humanity, where every decision she made could influence the future of the people who walked through her courtroom doors. It wasn't lost on her that her very presence, her title, her position, her experience, was a challenge to the biases that had long permeated the system. As she sat behind the bench for the first time, she was fully aware of what she represented, not just as a judge, but as a black woman in a space where her presence was still rare, even revolutionary. The reality of that moment filled her with both pride and determination. As the day wore on and the courtroom remained empty, the woman sat at her desk in the office behind the courtroom, reflecting on how far she had come. The challenges, the sacrifices, the pain, it all seemed so distant now, though she knew it had been a long and exhausting journey to get here. Her thoughts returned to that morning, to the tense encounter with the two officers. She knew that not every encounter would be as eye-opening as the one she had with them. She also knew that not everyone would understand the path she had taken or the reasons behind her decisions. But it was moments like that. Moments where the veil of bias was pulled back, even if just for an instant, that reminded her why she was here. She looked out of the window of her office, where the city skyline stretched out before her, the vast expanse of it all so much bigger than the challenges she had faced. It was a humbling sight, but one filled with endless possibilities. She took a deep breath and stood, walking toward the window. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting golden hues across the buildings and streets. It felt like the world was giving her a moment of peace, like the city was acknowledging her, just as it had earlier that morning. This was what progress looked like. But as she reflected on the path that had led her here, she knew there was still so much work to do. She had earned this seat, but it was not a seat for her alone. She had always believed that representation mattered. Having people in positions of power who could understand the challenges others faced was essential to creating real change. Her journey had not only been about personal triumph, it had been about the triumph of everyone who had ever been overlooked or judged unfairly. Her story was a reflection of their story. She walked back to her desk and sat down, opening a file in front of her. As she prepared for the upcoming cases, she thought about the bigger picture, the systemic issues she would have to tackle, the biases she would have to challenge, and the deep-seated inequalities she would be forced to confront. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked at the screen. Her first case had been assigned. It wasn't an easy one. It never would be. She read through the summary quickly, the weight of it hitting her all at once. This was why she was here. She picked up the phone, dialed a number, and when the line connected, she spoke with clarity and purpose. "We need to make sure that justice is applied to everyone equally. No exceptions, no bias." As she spoke, her voice was not just that of a judge. It was the voice of someone who had lived through the disparities in the system, someone who had fought for the seat she now held. She wasn't just here to interpret the law, she was here to reshape it, to make sure that it worked for everyone, not just for those with the most power or the loudest voice, but for the most vulnerable. Later, as the final cases for the day were adjourned and the building quieted down, she stood again, looking out the window. She could feel the weight of what she had to do, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a privilege. Her thoughts turned inward, remembering the hurdles she had faced to get here, the racial profiling, the long nights spent studying law when the odds seemed stacked against her, the moments when doors were closed in her face simply because of her skin color. But through it all, she had persevered. She had made it. And now, here she was. As the sun set behind the buildings, casting a final golden glow over the courthouse, The woman spoke softly to herself, almost as if she were speaking to the generations of women and men who had come before her, the ones who had paved the way. "I won't just judge the law," she whispered, her voice strong with conviction. "I'll judge how it's been applied to everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background." The world was changing. Slowly, surely, it was changing. And she was part of that change. And the journey ahead, her journey, had only just begun.